He thought he could wash the scent of another woman off his skin and walk right back into his perfect, insulated life. Warren ran the city's underworld with a brutal hand, but he treated his marriage like a quiet convenience. He expected to find his pregnant wife asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the cheap perfume and blood he dragged through the front door. Instead, he found a woman who hadn't just discovered his infidelity. She had already dismantled his empire. Welcome to the end of his world. The rain hit the windshield in heavy, rhythmic thuds, smearing the neon lights of the south side into long streaks of red and yellow. Warren gripped the steering wheel. The leather felt cold, damp from the humidity. He rolled the window down an inch, letting the frigid night air pull the lingering smell of cherry lotion and stale cigarette smoke from the cabin. It was Stella's smell. It clung to his collar, hid in the fibers of his expensive wool coat, and rested heavy at the back of his throat. He didn't love Stella. He wasn't even sure he liked her. But in a life built on extortion, broken jaws, and looking over his shoulder, Stella's cramped, dimly lit apartment was a vacuum. There were no expectations there. No talk of shipping manifests, offshore accounts, or the impending birth of a child that terrified him more than a loaded gun ever could. Warren pulled the Mercedes up to the heavy iron gates of his estate. The mechanical gears groaned, pulling the metal back to reveal the long, winding driveway, flanked by perfectly manicured oaks. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. His jaw was covered in dark stubble. His eyes were bruised with exhaustion. He rubbed a thumb hard over his jawline, scrubbing at a faint smudge of makeup he'd missed in Stella's bathroom. He parked in the garage, killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He sat there for a long minute, just breathing in the scent of motor oil and expensive leather. He was a man who compartmentalized everything. To the city, he was the ghost who controlled the docks. To the men he employed, he was the ruthless boss who cut out a rival's tongue last February. And to Nora, he was the stern but providing husband. Nora, a heavy knot formed in his gut, dense and uncomfortable. She was 6 months pregnant. She spent her days picking out cribs, reading books on infant psychology, and decorating a nursery that overlooked the gardens. She was pure. That was why he married her. She was a civilian, entirely removed from the grime of his day-to-day existence. He kept her isolated, safe, and heavily guarded. Warren stepped out of the car. The motion sensor lights flickered on, casting harsh white beams across the concrete. He walked to the side door that led into the mudroom. He reached out to punch his code into the security keypad, but his finger stopped an inch from the glass. The light on the panel was green. Unarmed, he frowned. Hayes, his head of security, had strict orders. The perimeter was to be locked down by 10 every night. It was past 3 in the morning. Warren pushed the door. It clicked open effortlessly. His hand instinctively drifted to the heavy holster inside his jacket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his sidearm. He stepped inside. The mudroom was dark. He walked into the kitchen. The vast marble countertops gleamed faintly under the glow of the oven clock. Everything was immaculate. No sign of a struggle. No broken glass. But the air felt thick. The ambient hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. He moved toward the foyer, unbuttoning his coat. He needed a shower. He needed to burn this shirt and scrub his skin with coarse soap until it turned red. Then he could climb into bed, wrap an arm around Nora's swelling stomach, and pretend he was a good man. A light flicked on in the study. Warren stopped. The study was his sanctuary. It was where he kept the ledgers, the encrypted laptops, the burner phones. Nora never went in there. She hated the smell of his cigars. He moved silently across the hardwood floor, pushing the heavy mahogany doors open. Nora sat behind his desk. She wasn't wearing the soft cotton nightgowns he was used to seeing her in. She wore a tailored black blouse and slacks, looking sharp, immaculate, and entirely awake. The soft glow of the desk lamp caught the sharp angle of her cheekbones and the dark, hollow rings under her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly into a low bun. She didn't look up right away. She was staring at a tablet screen, her manicured finger casually swiping through a document. A glass of ice water sat on a coaster to her right. "Nora?" Warren's voice was raspy, catching on the sudden dryness in his throat. He dropped his hand away from his holster. "What are you doing down here? It's 3 a.m. She slowly lifted her chin. Her eyes were empty. There was no warmth, no relief at seeing him home safe, and most notably, no anger. It was a terrifyingly blank stare. "You look tired, Warren," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual melodic lilt. "I am," he said, stepping into the room. He forced a weary smile, slipping into the practiced routine of the overworked provider. "Long night at the port. The union reps were stalling again. I had to sit down with them and iron out the contracts." Nora picked up the glass of water. The ice clinked against the crystal. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his. "The port," she repeated softly. She set the glass down. "Did the union reps wear Victoria's Secret? Or is that a new fragrance the stevedores are trying out?" Warren froze. The smile died on his face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall suddenly sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Warren stared at her. His mind, usually a steel trap capable of navigating hostile negotiations and violent threats, short-circuited. He had prepared for a dozen different crises tonight, but not this. He took a slow breath, buying time. He unbuttoned the rest of his coat and draped it over a leather armchair. "Nora, you're tired. Your hormones are all over the place. Let's go upstairs." "Don't," she said. It wasn't a shout. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that pinned him to the floor. "Don't insult my intelligence, and don't you dare blame this on the child you put inside me." She tapped the screen of the tablet. "Stella Martin, 424 West Elm Street, apartment 3B. She works as a bartender at the Crimson Room. You've been paying her rent for 6 months. You visit her every Tuesday and Thursday. Sometimes on Sundays when you tell me you're playing golf." Warren felt the blood drain from his face. The precision of the facts was a physical blow. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Nora, listen to me. It's not what you think. It means nothing. It's just stress. The business," Nora interrupted, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. Her hands rested protectively over the subtle swell of her stomach. "You thought I didn't know about the business. You thought I was just the quiet girl from the suburbs who liked nice shoes and didn't ask where the money came from. You don't know anything about my world," Warren said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. The husband was retreating. The boss was stepping forward. He didn't like being cornered, especially in his own home. Nora smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It didn't reach her eyes. "I know that the shipment from Miami didn't arrive at the docks tonight," she said. Warren stopped breathing. "What? 2 tons of product?" Nora continued casually, as if reading a grocery list. "It was intercepted on Route 9. The feds got an anonymous tip at exactly 1:15 a.m., right around the time you were probably unbuttoning Stella's shirt." "You're lying." Warren lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the desk. "How would you know that?" Nora tapped the tablet again and turned it around. It was a secure messaging app. His messaging app. He recognized the encryption interface immediately. "Because I sent the tip," she said. Warren stared at the screen. The text was right there, sent from his personal encrypted key. He looked up at her, disbelief warring with rising panic. "You went into my phone." "You sleep deeply, Warren. Especially when you come home exhausted from fucking someone else. She folded her hands on the desk. I didn't just find out about Stella tonight. I've known for 3 months. 3 months I sat across from you at dinner. 3 months I let you put your hands on my stomach. 3 months I watched you lie to my face. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. If the shipment was seized, he was on the hook for $4 million to the cartel. Nora, do you understand what you've done? You didn't just ruin a deal. You signed my death warrant. I know, she said quietly, but I didn't stop there. Warren's heart hammered violently against his ribs. What else did you do? Your offshore accounts in the Caymans, she said. The ones you set up under my maiden name to avoid the IRS audits? I drained them. I spent the last 3 weeks moving the funds through a series of shell companies. The money is gone, Warren. You can't have. Hayes monitors those accounts. Hayes is a mercenary, Nora said, tilting her head. He's loyal to the money, not to you. When I offered him a flat $5 million to look the other way and take a permanent vacation, he didn't even hesitate. He left the country 2 hours ago. The room spun. Warren gripped the mahogany wood until his knuckles turned white. He was standing in his own fortress, and it was entirely empty. His money, his security, his business, gone. Stripped down to the studs in the span of a single evening. Why? He croaked, the word tearing at his throat. If you wanted to leave, just leave. Why destroy me? Nora stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from him. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with absolute pity. Because if I just left, you would hunt me down, she said, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow certainty. You'd drag me back here and lock me in this gilded cage, and I would raise my child in a house built on blood and lies. You took away my choice the moment you brought your filth into our marriage. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. This has every ledger, every payout, every corrupt judge on your payroll. I've programmed it to blast to the district attorney, the FBI, and the local news stations at 6 a.m. She looked at the grandfather clock. You have exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes before every federal agent in this state kicks down that front door. Warren fell to his knees. The strength evaporated from his legs. He looked up at the woman he thought he owned. She was a stranger. A beautiful, ruthless stranger holding the ashes of his life. Nora, please, he begged, a tear finally breaking free and tracking down his stubbled cheek. For the baby. Please. She looked down at him, her expression hardening into stone. I'm doing this for the baby, she whispered. She turned and walked out of the study, the click of her heels echoing down the long, empty hallway, leaving Warren alone in the dark. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked. Each swing of the brass pendulum felt like a physical strike against Warren's skull. 3:20 in the morning. He had 2 hours and 40 minutes. He stayed on his knees for a long time after the front door clicked shut. The house was entirely silent, stripped of the ambient hum of security personnel pacing the perimeter. Nora had paid them all off. She had walked out of the house, carrying his child, his money, and his life, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a ticking clock. He finally stood. His knees cracked, stiff and protesting. The adrenaline that usually carried him through violent altercations wasn't there. Instead, there was a deep, hollow nausea. He leaned heavily against the mahogany desk, knocking over the crystal water glass Nora had left behind. It shattered against the hardwood floor. The sharp noise snapped him out of his paralysis. Warren was a survivor. You didn't rise to the top of the city's underworld by lying down when the floor fell out from under you. You clawed your way back up. He moved. He walked out of the study and down the hall, his boots crunching over the broken glass. He bypassed the master bedroom. He knew better than to check the wall safe hidden behind the oil painting. If Nora had the sophistication to drain offshore accounts through shell companies, the physical cash in the bedroom was already in her duffel bag. He headed for the basement. The air grew colder with every step down the wooden stairs. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space smelling of damp earth and old concrete. He walked to the far corner, past the stacked boxes of holiday decorations Nora had carefully labelled with a black marker. He crouched beside the main support pillar and ran his fingers over the dirt floor until he found the metal ring. He pulled. A heavy concrete slab lifted, revealing a small, dry space beneath the foundation. Inside sat a black canvas duffel bag. He unzipped it. Inside was $50,000 in unmarked, non-sequential bills, 3 prepaid burner phones, 2 forged Canadian passports bearing different names, and a matte black Glock 19 with 4 loaded magazines. It wasn't $5 million, but it was enough to get across the border and buy a ghost existence until he figured out how to kill the men coming for him. Warren pulled out one of the phones. He powered it on. The screen cast a harsh blue light over his face. He punched in a number he had memorized 10 years ago. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." "Leo," Warren said. His voice was steady now, stripped of the panic he had shown Nora. "I need a ride. Now." There was a heavy pause on the other end. Leo was a mid-level enforcer, a guy who handled collections on the east side. He wasn't high enough on the food chain for Nora to have bought off, but he was hungry enough to be useful. "Boss? It's 3:30. "I don't care what time it is. Bring the grey sedan. Park it 2 blocks down from the main estate gates, on the access road by the reservoir. Leave the headlights off. Do not drive onto the property. You have 15 minutes. "Understood." The line went dead. Warren slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. He chambered around in the Glock, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the damp basement. He tucked the weapon into the waistband of his trousers. He didn't bother going back upstairs for his coat. The less time he spent in the house, the better. He exited through the basement storm doors, pushing them open into the relentless rain. The cold water hit him instantly, soaking through his expensive dress shirt, pasting his dark hair to his forehead. He didn't flinch. He stayed low, moving quickly across the expansive back lawn. He avoided the driveway. If Hayes had truly abandoned his post, there was a chance he had tipped off a rival crew on his way out. The estate was a sitting target. Warren moved through the dense line of oak trees that bordered the property, the mud sucking at his leather shoes. His chest heaved. The physical exertion was nothing, but the psychological weight was dragging him down. Nora. The image of her sitting at his desk, perfectly composed, flashed in his mind. He had thought her so fragile. He had treated her like glass. When she asked about his late nights, he had patted her hand and fed her lies about union negotiations and real estate deals. She hadn't just swallowed the lies, she had digested them, studied them, and used them to map his entire infrastructure. He reached the wrought iron perimeter fence. It was 10 feet high, topped with decorative spikes. He threw the heavy duffel bag over. It landed in the wet grass on the other side with a dull thud. Warren jumped, grabbing the cold metal bars, and hauled his body weight up. His muscles burned. He swung his leg over the top, carefully avoiding the spikes, and dropped to the ground on the other side. He landed poorly, his ankle twisted on a slick patch of wet leaves, sending a sharp spike of pain up his calf. He bit down on a curse, forcing himself to stand. He grabbed the bag and limped into the tree line that bordered the reservoir access road. Through the pouring rain, he saw the dull silhouette of a car idling by the curb. The headlights were off. Warren approached slowly, his hand resting on the grip of the Glock tucked in his waistband. He tapped the passenger side window twice. The locks clicked open. Warren slid into the passenger seat, pulling the wet duffel bag onto his lap. The heater was blasting, but he couldn't stop shivering. Leo gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting to Warren. "Jesus, boss, you look like hell." "Drive," Warren said, staring straight out the windshield. "Get us to the warehouse on 4th Street. "We got a problem," Leo said, putting the car in drive but moving slowly. He didn't look at Warren. His knuckles were white. "Word is already out on the street. The Miami shipment got pinched on Route 9. Sullivan is losing his mind. He's putting it on you." "I know," Warren said. "Just drive." "You don't understand," Leo said, his voice tightening. "Sullivan didn't call a meeting. He put a price on your head. 2 million. Open contract. The whole city is looking for you." The streetlights bled past the rain-streaked windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the interior of the car. Warren processed Leo's words with a cold, terrifying detachment. $2 million. Sullivan was the cartel's main distributor on the eastern seaboard. He didn't broker deals, he brokered violence. If Sullivan had put an open contract out, it meant Warren's own men would be hunting him by sunrise. "Who did you talk to?" Warren asked. His voice was a flat, even drawl. He kept his right hand resting casually over his stomach, inches from the grip of his pistol. "Nobody," Leo said defensively. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the glass. "I got a text from one of the guys at the docks, just a heads up. Said the feds rolled the trucks, and Sullivan's fixers were already mobilizing. Everyone thinks you set it up to skim the product and run." "And what do you think, Leo?" Leo swallowed hard. The streetlights caught the beads of sweat forming on his upper lip. "I think you're in my passenger seat, soaking wet at 4 in the morning. I think if you had the product, you'd be on a private jet, not hiding in a 10-year-old Honda." "Good logic." Warren stared at the passing storefronts. They were deep in the industrial district now. Chain-link fences, abandoned factories, and the distant looming cranes of the shipyards. "Keep going past 4th Street. Change of plans. Take us to Arthur's place." Leo's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "The mechanic? Boss? Arthur is a ghost. He doesn't want anything to do with cartel business." "Arthur owes me his life," Warren said coldly. "He'll do what I say. Just get us there." The car fell silent, save for the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Warren closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The exhaustion was setting in, deep in his marrow. He thought of his unborn child. A son or a daughter? Nora had refused to find out the gender. She said she wanted a surprise. The memory made a bitter laugh catch in his throat. She certainly had a talent for surprises. Where was she right now? Sitting in a first-class lounge? Driving across state lines? She had the money. She had Hayes. She was untouchable, wrapped in the protective cocoon of a $5 million bribe. She had orchestrated this perfectly. Wait until he was exhausted. Wait until the largest shipment of the year was in transit. Strike when his guard was entirely dropped in his own home. The car slowed. Leo turned down a narrow alleyway behind an abandoned textile mill. The headlights swept across a row of rusted dumpsters and a heavy, corrugated metal garage door. "Stop here," Warren ordered. Leo parked the car, leaving the engine running. The exhaust plumed in the cold, damp air. Warren grabbed his duffel bag. "Wait here. Keep it in drive," Warren said. He stepped out of the vehicle, the rain immediately plastering his shirt to his skin again. He walked up to a small, heavy steel door next to the garage bay. He pounded on it 3 times, paused and pounded twice more. A minute passed. Nothing. Warren pounded again, harder. "Arthur, open the door!" A small peephole slid open with a metallic scrape. A pair of dark, paranoid eyes looked out. The peephole slammed shut. Several heavy deadbolts clicked, echoing in the narrow alley. The door cracked open, revealing a gaunt, older man in oil-stained overalls holding a sawed-off shotgun aimed directly at Warren's chest. "You're a dead man, Warren," Arthur rasped. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a boot. "You shouldn't be here. Put the gun away, Arthur, or I'll take it from you and beat you to death with the stock," Warren said. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his hands. He just stared the older man down. Arthur's grip on the weapon wavered. He let the barrel drop an inch. "Sullivan's guys are tearing up the Lower East Side. They hit your club 20 minutes ago, burned it to the ground. Anyone inside is dead." Warren felt a muscle jump in his jaw. The club, his sanctuary, the place he had built from nothing. Gone. "I need wheels," Warren said, pushing past the barrel of the shotgun and stepping into the dimly lit garage. It smelled of motor oil, stale coffee, and raw anxiety. "Something fast, untraceable, and heavy, and I need a radio tapped into the police bands." Arthur closed the door behind him, locking the deadbolts. "I can give you a modified Charger. Armor-plated doors, swapped plates, clean VIN. But it's going to cost you 50 grand. Warren unzipped the duffel bag, pulled out a thick stack of banded bills, and threw it on a grease-stained workbench. "Take it. Bring the car around to the alley." Arthur looked at the money, then at Warren. He shook his head. "You're not going to make it out of the city, Warren. They've locked down the bridges. They're paying the beat cops to look the other way while they set up roadblocks. I don't need to get out of the city yet," Warren said, checking the magazine in his Glock. He slammed it back into the grip. "I need to make a phone call, and then I need to kill a man." Before Arthur could reply, the deafening shatter of glass ripped through the garage. Warren hit the concrete floor instantly, his training taking over before his brain even registered the sound. Gunfire erupted from the alleyway. High-caliber rounds chewed through the corrugated metal door, throwing sparks and jagged shrapnel across the garage. Arthur screamed as a round caught him in the shoulder, spinning the old man around. He dropped the shotgun and collapsed behind a stack of tires. Warren scrambled behind the engine block of a dismantled sedan. His heart hammered in his throat. The gunfire was concentrated, automatic. They had found him. He risked a glance over the hood. Outside, through the bullet holes in the door, he saw the Honda. Leo was still sitting in the driver's seat. He wasn't shooting. He wasn't driving away. He was just sitting there, completely still. A dark figure in a tactical vest stood next to the driver's side window, a smoking assault rifle in his hands. Leo hadn't been paralyzed by fear. He had been waiting. The text message from the docks wasn't a warning. It was coordinates. Leo had driven him straight into Sullivan's kill box to collect the $2 million. Warren gritted his teeth. He pressed his back against the cold engine block, listening to the heavy boots kicking against the exterior steel door. He had 50 rounds, $50,000, and nowhere to go. He closed his eyes, took a breath of air thick with cordite and engine grease, and lifted his gun. The steel door groaned inward, the hinges screaming in protest as heavy boots kicked at the exterior. Warren didn't move. He kept his breathing shallow, his back pressed hard against the cold iron of the dismantled engine block. The air in the garage was thick with the suffocating smell of gunpowder and atomized engine oil. Another violent kick. The top hinge sheared off with a sharp metallic snap. The door sagged, hanging precariously by the bottom lock. "Flash it," a muffled voice ordered from the alley. Warren closed his eyes tightly and tucked his chin to his chest. A second later, a stun grenade bounced through the gap in the doorway and detonated. The concussive blast shook the dust from the rafters. A blinding white light flashed behind Warren's closed eyelids, and a high-pitched ringing pierced his eardrums. He didn't wait for his vision to fully clear. He rolled out from behind the engine block. Through the lingering smoke, two figures stepped into the garage. They wore dark tactical gear, moving with the practiced efficiency of ex-military contractors. Sullivan didn't hire street thugs for high-value targets. Warren aimed low. He squeezed the trigger twice. The Glock bucked in his hands. The first round caught the lead man in the right kneecap, shattering the joint. The man went down with a guttural scream, his rifle clattering against the concrete. The second man pivoted, bringing his muzzle down toward Warren. Warren fired 3 more times in rapid succession. 2 rounds sparked harmlessly against the man's ceramic chest plate, but the third caught him in the exposed flesh of his throat. He dropped instantly, a spray of dark blood painting the side of a rusted tool cabinet. Warren scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain radiating from his twisted ankle. He kept his weapon raised, advancing on the downed man with the shattered knee. The contractor was writhing on the floor, frantically clawing for a sidearm strapped to his thigh. Warren stepped on the man's wrist, pinning it to the concrete, and put a bullet through his head. The ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by the heavy, ragged sound of his own breathing. He scanned the alleyway through the broken door. It was empty. They had only sent 2 men to breach, leaving Leo outside to contain the perimeter. Warren turned back to the garage. Arthur was slumped behind the stack of tires, clutching his shoulder. Dark arterial blood pumped steadily through his grease-stained fingers, pooling on the floor. His breathing was wet and shallow. Warren knelt beside him. He pulled off his wet dress shirt, wadded it up, and pressed it hard against the old man's wound. Arthur let out a wet gasp, his head lolling back against the rubber treads. "Don't," Arthur rasped, his voice barely a whisper. His hand reached out, weakly grabbing Warren's forearm. It hit the artery. "I'm done." "Shut up," Warren said, his voice flat. He pressed harder. "Where are the keys to the Charger?" Arthur coughed, a line of blood trickling down his chin. He weakly patted the front pocket of his overalls. Warren reached in and pulled out a heavy fob. "Under the tarp. Back bay," Arthur breathed out. His eyes were starting to glaze over, fixing on the ceiling. "Kill them, Warren. Kill them all." Arthur's chest stopped moving. The garage fell entirely silent. Warren stared at the old man for a long second. Arthur had been fixing his cars since Warren was a street-level enforcer, boosting radios to pay rent. Now he was just another corpse in a night entirely composed of them. Warren stood up. The cold air bit at his bare chest. He grabbed his wetsuit coat from the floor, shrugging it on over his skin to stave off the chill, and walked to the back bay. He pulled the heavy canvas tarp back. The Dodge Charger sat low to the ground, painted in a matte black that swallowed the dim light. The windows were thick, reinforced ballistic glass. He opened the door. The heavy armor plating made it swing slowly. He threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. He pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life with a deep, modified growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Warren shifted into gear. He didn't bother with the remote for the garage door. He slammed his foot on the gas. The Charger surged forward, 2 tons of Detroit steel and aftermarket armor. It hit the corrugated metal door at 40 miles an hour. The door buckled and tore away from the tracks with a deafening crash, folding over the hood of the car as Warren burst into the alleyway. The Honda was still blocking the exit. Leo was standing outside the driver's door now, a pistol in his hand, looking panicked. Warren didn't touch the brakes. He gripped the steering wheel and accelerated. Leo's eyes widened in the headlights. He raised his gun, firing wildly. The bullets pinged off the Charger's reinforced windshield like pebbles. The Charger slammed into the side of the Honda with a sickening crunch of metal. The impact threw Leo backward, crushing his legs between the crumpled chassis and the brick wall of the alley. Warren kept his foot pinned to the floor, pushing the wreckage of the sedan out into the street. Metal sparked against asphalt. He cut the wheel hard to the left, disengaging from the mangled Honda, and sped out onto the slick, rain-soaked pavement of the industrial district. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Leo was a broken heap on the ground, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. Warren drove. His hands were shaking slightly. He gripped the leather wheel tighter to force them still. The adrenaline was burning out, leaving behind a cold, brutal clarity. Nora had planned all of this. She hadn't just tipped off the feds about the route. She had orchestrated the timing perfectly. She knew Sullivan was unstable. She knew that a missing shipment of that size would immediately trigger a cartel response. She hadn't just drained his accounts. She had weaponized his own underworld against him. He remembered her sitting in the study, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She hadn't looked scared. She had looked resolved. She was clearing the board to ensure he could never come looking for her. A grim, humorless smile touched the corner of Warren's mouth. He had married her because he thought she was soft. He thought she was a quiet, harmless civilian. Instead, he had invited an apex predator into his home, and she had waited patiently until he was asleep to bite down on his throat. Warren parked the Charger deep inside an unfinished underground parking structure beneath a halted commercial development downtown. The concrete pillars were damp, and exposed rebar hung from the ceiling like rusted teeth. It was a dead zone. No cameras, no security patrols, and no cell service. He left the engine idling to keep the heater running. The dashboard clock read 4:15 a.m. He reached into the duffel bag and pulled out one of the burner phones. He needed a signal. He stepped out of the car, his bare chest shivering under the damp wool of his coat, and walked toward the entrance ramp until a single bar of service appeared on the cheap digital screen. He dialed a number. It rang twice. "Yeah," a groggy voice answered. "Russo," Warren said. His voice was a rasp of exhaustion. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. FBI Special Agent Russo was on Warren's payroll. He was an expensive asset, a man who fed Warren federal wiretap schedules in exchange for offshore wire transfers. "Warren, are you out of your fucking mind calling me right now?" Russo's voice was a frantic hiss. "Do you have any idea what's happening down here? Tell me." "The whole bureau is upside down. The Miami shipment got intercepted on Route 9. But that's not even the half of it. The district attorney, my boss, and the local news stations just got hit with a massive encrypted data dump. It's everything. Ledgers, payoffs, names, dates. Your entire operation is bleeding out on national television in about 30 minutes. Warren froze. The cold air in the concrete tunnel suddenly felt suffocating. The data dump already happened? 20 minutes ago, Russo snapped. Woke up half the federal judges in the state. Arrest warrants are being signed right now. They're coming for you, Warren. They're coming for all of us. You need to tell me my name isn't on those ledgers. Warren lowered the phone slowly. You have exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes before every federal agent in this state kicks down that front door. That was what Nora had told him in the study. She had looked at the grandfather clock and given him a timeline. A timeline of 6 series a.m. She lied. She had already sent the files before he even walked into the house. She had given him a fake deadline. Why? The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of his lungs. She wanted him to run. If he had stayed in the house and waited for the police, he would have been arrested. He would have been taken into federal custody, placed in a secure holding cell, and kept alive for a trial. He would have eventually beaten the charges with high-priced lawyers, or at worst, run his empire from a minimum security prison cell. Nora didn't want him in prison. She wanted him dead. By giving him a fake timeline, she forced him to flee into the night like a panicked animal. She forced him out of his secure fortress and directly into the streets. Streets she knew were crawling with Sullivan's hitmen looking for their missing product. She didn't just want the feds to dismantle his business. She wanted the cartel to execute him before the sun came up. Warren, are you there? Russo's voice tinny and desperate through the phone speaker. Warren brought the phone back to his ear. Your name is on the ledger, Russo. She kept meticulous records. Who? Who kept records? Warren, listen to me. Warren hung up. He tossed the burner phone onto the wet concrete and crushed it under the heel of his leather shoe. He walked back to the Charger and slid into the driver's seat. He slammed the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside the warm, leather-scented cabin. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel. His wife. His beautiful, pregnant wife. She was a ghost now. With Hayes protecting her, and $5 million in clean cash, she could be anywhere in the world by tomorrow. She would buy a house with a white picket fence in some quiet suburb. She would paint the nursery a soft yellow. She would raise their child entirely free of his shadow, built on the ashes of his empire. He sat up. He looked at the Glock resting on the passenger seat beside the duffel bag. He couldn't undo the damage. The FBI had his ledgers. His money was gone. His men had turned on him. His business was dead. But he refused to die quietly in the dark for a cartel boss who couldn't see past his own greed. If Sullivan wanted a war, he would bring it to his front door. Warren picked up the Glock. He checked the magazine, slamming it back into place with a sharp, satisfying click. He didn't have an army anymore. He didn't have leverage or political protection. He was a dead man breathing on borrowed time. But a dead man had nothing to lose. He reached into the bag and pulled out a spare magazine, sliding it into his coat pocket. He grabbed one of the forged passports and flipped it open. The face staring back at him was his own, but the eyes looked hollow, stripped of the arrogance that had defined his life. He put the Charger in gear. The headlights illuminated the cracked concrete of the ramp leading back up to the surface. It was 4:30 a.m. He had an hour and a half before the sun came up, before the city woke to the news of his downfall. He didn't know where Nora was, but he knew exactly where Sullivan slept. A sprawling penthouse in the financial district, heavily guarded, impenetrable to law enforcement, but familiar territory to a man who had designed its security protocols 3 years ago. Warren steered the heavy car up the ramp, bursting out of the underground tunnel and back into the relentless driving rain. He wasn't running anymore. The husband was dead. The boss was dead. All that remained was the violence. And he was going to burn Sullivan's house down before he let them take him. The financial district was a graveyard of glass and steel at 5 in the morning. The torrential rain had finally dialed back to a freezing, persistent mist, leaving the towering skyscrapers shrouded in a low-hanging grey fog. The streets were entirely empty. The city's white-collar workforce wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. Right now, the only things moving in the concrete canyons were sanitation trucks and a matte black Dodge Charger running without headlights. Warren pulled the heavy vehicle into a narrow alleyway connecting 2 high-rise parking structures. He killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic pinging of the cooling exhaust manifold. He sat in the dark for a full minute, resting his head against the steering wheel. The adrenaline from the garage shootout had fully evaporated, leaving a toxic sludge of fatigue in his veins. His twisted right ankle throbbed with a dull, hot rhythm. The cold dampness of his wool coat clung to his bare chest. He was shivering, though he couldn't tell if it was from the freezing ambient temperature or the profound shock of his entire existence collapsing in 3 hours. He didn't want to get out of the car. A quiet, pathetic voice in the back of his mind told him to just start the engine again. Drive north. Keep driving until the gas ran out, ditch the car, and use the forged Canadian passport to disappear into a snowy oblivion. He could tend bar in a town where no one knew his face. He could survive, but Sullivan's contract meant there was nowhere to hide. The cartel had reach. They would find him in a month, a year, or 5 years. They would drag him into a basement and take pieces off him with a pair of pliers until he confessed to stealing a shipment he never touched. And worse, they might find Nora. Warren hated his wife in this moment. He hated her brilliance and her absolute cruelty. But the thought of Sullivan's men finding her, of them touching her, or the child she carried, sent a spike of pure, violent revulsion through his chest. He was going to die today, but he was going to take the architect of his execution with him. He grabbed the Glock off the passenger seat and tucked it into his waistband. He slipped the spare magazine into his coat pocket. He stepped out of the Charger, testing his weight on his bad ankle. Pain shot up his calf, sharp and blinding. He gritted his teeth, forced a limp out of his stride, and walked toward the monolithic structure across the street. Sullivan lived in the penthouse of the Apex Tower. It was an 80-story fortress of luxury condominiums favored by foreign diplomats, tech billionaires, and cartel distributors laundering their cash through real estate. The front lobby was manned by 3 armed guards and required biometric scans to access the residential elevators. It was a suicide run to go through the front doors, but Warren had designed the security layout 3 years ago when Sullivan first bought the property. Sullivan had wanted to ensure the local police couldn't raid him without warning. Warren had built in blind spots. He moved along the perimeter of the building, sticking to the shadows, until he reached the loading docks in the back. A massive, rolling steel door was shut tight, but right beside it was a heavy service door. Warren checked his watch. 5:15. Right on time, the distinct rumble of a commercial sanitation truck echoed down the narrow access street. It backed up to the loading dock, hydraulic brakes hissing in the damp air. The driver, a guy in a bright orange vest, hopped out and punched a code into the keypad beside the service door. The lock clicked green. The driver pulled the door open, propping it with a heavy rubber wedge to drag out the trash bins. Warren didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, sliding behind the driver's blind spot, and slipped through the open door into the fluorescent-lit service corridor. The air inside smelled sharply of industrial bleach and rotting garbage. He bypassed the security cameras perfectly, pressing himself against the cinder-block walls, keeping his head down below the lens's sweeping arcs. He navigated a maze of utility rooms and water heater closets until he reached the freight elevator. It was a massive, scarred metal box used for moving furniture and construction materials. It didn't require a biometric scan, just a physical override key. Warren pulled a small steel tension wrench and a pick from the inner lining of his coat. It was a habit he had never broken from his days boosting cars. He knelt beside the elevator call panel, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He worked the pins inside the lock. 1, 2, 3. A satisfying click resonated in the quiet hall. The heavy doors ground open. He stepped inside and hit the button for the 79th floor. The freight elevator didn't go directly into the penthouse. It stopped 1 floor below, opening into a mechanical maintenance hallway. From there, it was a single flight of stairs up to Sullivan's private entrance. The elevator began its slow, agonizing ascent. The cables groaned and popped. Warren watched the digital floor indicator tick upward. 10, 20, 40. The higher he went, the heavier the silence became. He pulled the Glock from his waistband and held it down by his side. He cracked his neck, the sound loud in the enclosed metal box. 78. 79. The elevator jolted to a halt. The doors slid apart. 2 men in dark suits were standing in the maintenance hallway, holding steaming cups of coffee. They weren't supposed to be there. Sullivan must have doubled his security detail after the FBI raid alerts went out. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The guards stared at the soaked, exhausted man standing in the elevator with a gun by his side. Warren raised the Glock. The enclosed space magnified the sound of the gunshot into a concussive roar. Warren didn't aim for center mass. The men were wearing thick Kevlar vests under their tailored jackets. He snapped the muzzle up and fired twice. The first guard's head snapped back, his coffee cup exploding across the grey concrete floor as he crumpled backward. The second guard dropped his drink and clawed frantically at the holster under his arm. Warren stepped out of the elevator, closing the distance before the man could draw. He drove his left elbow hard into the guard's face. feeling the satisfying crunch of cartilage, then shoved the barrel of the Glock directly under the man's chin and pulled the trigger. The guard collapsed in a heap. The hallway fell dead silent, save for the high-pitched ringing in Warren's ears and the drip of spilled coffee seeping into the concrete. He didn't pause. Momentum was the only thing keeping him vertical. He stepped over the bodies, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor, and headed for the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor. It led to the private stairwell. He pushed it open, his gun leading the way. The stairwell was empty. He took the steps 2 at a time, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle. He reached the top landing. A heavy mahogany door stood between him and Sullivan's penthouse. It was locked, secured by a heavy magnetic seal. Warren raised his leg and delivered a devastating front kick directly next to the handle. The wood splintered, but the frame held. He kicked it again, throwing his entire body weight behind the strike. The heavy deadbolt tore through the wood, and the door burst open. Warren stepped into the penthouse. The contrast was jarring. The air inside was warm and smelled of expensive vanilla candles and old money. White plush carpets stretched across an expansive living room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the waking city. The sky outside was turning a bruised, deep purple. Modern art hung on the walls. It was a pristine, insulated sanctuary, entirely separated from the blood and rain of the streets below. "Who's there?" a voice barked from down the hall. Warren moved toward the sound, his weapon raised. He stepped into a massive study, lined with dark bookshelves. Sitting behind a sleek glass desk was Sullivan. He was an older man, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a silk robe over his pajamas. He had a phone pressed to his ear, his face pale and drawn. Sullivan froze when he saw Warren. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the glass desktop. "Hang up," Warren said, his voice raw and gravelly. Sullivan slowly reached down and tapped the screen, ending the call. He looked at Warren, his eyes darting to the Glock, then back up to Warren's face. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. "You shouldn't be here, Warren," Sullivan said, holding his hands up slowly. "The feds are kicking down doors across the city. The DA is signing 50 indictments right now. My lawyers are telling me to get on a plane to Dubai. You put a $2 million contract on my head," Warren said, stepping further into the room. He kept his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You sent men to kill me in Arthur's garage. You burned my club down." "You stole 2 tons of product," Sullivan yelled, a sudden flash of anger cutting through his fear. "You hijacked the Miami trucks and leaked the route to the Bureau to cover your tracks. You brought the entire federal government down on our heads." "It wasn't me," Warren said. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. "I didn't take your product. I didn't leak the files. I was asleep in my own house." Sullivan stared at him, his brow furrowing. "Then who did?" "My wife." The words hung in the warm air of the study. Sullivan blinked, his mind struggling to process the information. "Nora, your pregnant wife. Are you out of your mind? She's a civilian. She doesn't know anything about the logistics." "She knew everything," Warren said softly. The exhaustion was pulling at his bones, begging him to just lie down on the expensive Persian rug. "She cloned my secure phone. She drained my offshore accounts. She waited until the biggest shipment of the year was moving, tipped the feds to trigger a cartel panic, and then dumped my ledgers to the DA." Sullivan slowly lowered his hands. The realization washed over his weathered face. He sat back in his chair, suddenly looking very old. "She pitted us against each other. She used my paranoia to execute you." "She did," Warren agreed. "Where is she?" "Gone, with $5 million and a ghost team protecting her." Warren stared at the older man. "We built an empire on intimidation, Sullivan. We killed men for looking at us wrong. And a woman who spent her afternoons picking out nursery colors tore it all down in 3 hours without firing a single shot. Sullivan let out a long, slow breath. He reached toward the top drawer of his desk. "It's over, Warren. For both of us. The feds will be in this lobby in 10 minutes. If you kill me, you add murder to a federal indictment. Walk away. Take whatever cash you have and run." "I don't run," Warren said. Sullivan's hand suddenly darted into the drawer. He whipped out a silver revolver, bringing it up with surprising speed. Warren fired first. 3 rounds tore through the center of Sullivan's chest. The impact threw the older man backward out of his chair, but Sullivan's finger jerked on the trigger as he fell. A single shot echoed through the study. Warren felt a sudden, brutal punch to his left side, just below his ribs. It didn't burn immediately. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out, and crashed onto his knees. He dropped his gun on the carpet and looked down. A dark red stain was spreading rapidly across the white fabric of his dress shirt, soaking into the wool coat. The pain finally registered, a hot, tearing agony that sucked the oxygen from his lungs. He looked up at the glass desk. Sullivan was slumped on the floor behind it, completely still. Warren pressed a trembling hand against his side. His blood felt hot against his freezing skin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the first rays of morning light breaking over the city skyline. And in the distance, cutting through the quiet dawn, he heard the faint, rising wail of police sirens. The pain wasn't a sharp sting anymore. It had evolved into a deep, radiant heat spreading outward from his ribs, turning the muscles of his abdomen into dead weight. Warren leaned heavily against the edge of the glass desk, leaving a smeared, crimson handprint on the pristine surface. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps that rattled wetly in the back of his throat. He pressed his arm harder against his side, trying to clamp the wound, but the blood simply flowed between his fingers, thick and warm, soaking into the plush white carpet beneath his knees. He forced himself to move. Staying on his knees felt like begging, and he had promised himself a long time ago that he would never die in a posture of submission. Using the heavy oak frame of a nearby bookshelf for leverage, Warren dragged himself to his feet. His legs shook violently under the strain. The world tilted, the edges of his vision blurring into a static grey haze. He took a stumbling step forward, leaving a trail of dark, heavy droplets across the rug, and aimed for the floor-to-ceiling windows. He hit the glass hard, his shoulder slamming into the reinforced pane. He slid down slightly until his forehead rested against the cold, smooth surface. It felt incredibly grounding against his feverish skin. Outside, the city was fully waking up. The deep purple bruising of the night sky was giving way to the pale, slate-grey light of early dawn. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt of the financial district slick and reflective. And reflecting off that wet pavement was an ocean of flashing red and blue lights. Warren looked down at the streets 79 floors below. A dozen armored SWAT vehicles and countless black federal SUVs were forming a massive, impenetrable perimeter around the base of the apex tower. Tactical teams were pouring out of the transports, tiny black figures moving with coordinated, militaristic precision. They were securing the exits, establishing fallback lines, and setting up command tents. The sirens wailed in a dissonant, overlapping chorus that drifted up through the thick glass. It sounded like a funeral dirge. He didn't look for a way out. There was no escape hatch, no hidden duffel bag of cash, and no miracle left to play. His empire, built over 15 years of extortion, violence, and intimidation, had been entirely dismantled in a span of 3 hours. Warren slid his back against the glass and sank to the floor, his legs giving out completely. He sat facing the heavy mahogany doors he had kicked open minutes earlier. He left the Glock lying on the carpet 10 feet away. He didn't have the strength to lift it, and even if he did, he had no desire to die in a meaningless shootout with a federal entry team. He was exhausted. He looked at the blood pooling around his leather shoes. Then, strangely, His mind drifted away from the sirens, and the dead cartel boss slumped behind the desk. His thoughts drifted entirely to Nora. He tried to picture her in the cramped, dimly lit study of their estate, typing the commands that ruined him. He had spent his entire marriage believing she was fragile. He had kept her in a gilded cage, thinking he was protecting her from the harsh realities of his existence, when in truth, she was studying the cage's structural weaknesses. She hadn't just tolerated his lies, she had weaponized them. He thought about the child, a son or a daughter he would never meet. He closed his eyes, resting the back of his head against the window. Somewhere right now, Nora was thousands of miles away. She was probably sitting in the spacious cabin of a chartered jet, sipping sparkling water and watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. She had $5 million of clean money. She had a new identity. She had a clean slate, paid for with the absolute destruction of his life. A bitter, cynical laugh bubbled up in his chest, turning into a wet, painful cough. He spat a mouthful of blood onto his ruined wool coat. She had won. It wasn't even a contest. He had played checkers while she was quietly moving grandmaster chess pieces across the board. The cheap perfume on his collar hadn't just ended his marriage. It had ended his life. Heavy, methodical thuds echoed from the private stairwell. The tactile teams were moving up. They were bypassing the elevators, clearing every floor, their boots marching in absolute synchronization. Warren didn't flinch. He just watched the shattered doorway. The cold from the window seeped into his bones, numbing the tearing agony in his side. The edges of the room began to turn black, the expensive art on the walls fading into the shadows. "Breaching!" A muffled voice barked from the stairwell. A heavy battering ram smashed into the remnants of the mahogany door, taking the frame entirely off the hinges. The wood splintered violently, crashing into the penthouse. Flashlights cut through the dim light of the hallway, a half-dozen laser sights sweeping across the walls, the furniture, and finally settling squarely on Warren's chest. "FBI, show me your hands. Keep them where I can see them." The tactical officers flooded the room, their assault rifles raised, moving with aggressive, overwhelming force. They cleared the corners, shouting commands, their heavy boots trampling over the pristine white carpet, smearing Sullivan's blood and Warren's blood into the fibers. "Target is down. We need a medic up here, now." Two officers rushed toward Warren, kicking the discarded Glock across the room. One of them grabbed his shoulder, pressing a heavy, gloved hand hard against the gunshot wound. The sudden pressure sent a final, blinding spike of pain through his nervous system. "Stay with me," the officer yelled, his face entirely obscured by a ballistic helmet and goggles. "Look at me." But Warren didn't look at the federal agent. He looked past him, staring out the massive windows at the pale, breaking dawn. The cold was finally absolute. The sirens faded into a distant, hollow ringing, and as the darkness completely overtook his vision, the last thing Warren felt was a profound, devastating respect for the woman who put him in the ground. Warren's empire didn't fall to rival guns, cartel betrayals, or a federal sting. It fell to a woman who simply refused to be a victim. Nora took the ultimate revenge, turning his own violent world against him while walking away without a single scratch. Did Warren get exactly what he deserved for his arrogance and infidelity, or was Nora's calculated punishment too brutal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.